Imagine a family photo from 1903. The soft lighting, the solemn faces, the children standing next to their father. It all looks perfectly normal until you realize that the man in the center of the picture may have died before the camera could click. The story begins with a seemingly prosperous American family, but in reality, quietly reeling under the weight of the economic crisis. To stay alive, they resort to a desperate solution, a hoax staged using the lens of photography, the newest and most reliable technology of the time. But when the secret is buried, it not only saves a sum of money, but also casts a haunting shadow that lasts for generations. Tonight, we follow a strange portrait through lost letters, unexpected investigations, and hear the echoes of a family bound by silence. One question will follow us all the way: can a lie, even one born of love and despair, really be buried forever? In the autumn of 1903, a family gathered in their finest clothes and smiled for the camera. At first glance, the portrait seemed ordinary. 3 generations seated together in a polished studio, their lives frozen in a single moment of prosperity. But when historians would later lean closer, their eyes drawn toward the figure of the grandfather at the center, they would uncover something deeply unsettling. Professor Amanda Rivers had spent nearly a decade cataloging quiet relics at the Philadelphia Museum of American History. She thought she had seen everything. But on a crisp October morning, when a collection from the estate of Harold Pembroke arrived, hundreds of photographs of early 20th century families, it was one particular image that refused to let her go. The portrait showed a prosperous household, parents, grown children with spouses, bright grandchildren. At the center sat the patriarch, his white beard distinguished his suit impeccable. Yet something about him unsettled her. His posture was too rigid, his eyes too glassy, too distant. The studio mark confirmed the date, October 15th, 1903. And in the studio's meticulous ledger, one unusual phrase appeared beside the Whitmore family's name: special arrangements requested. When Professor Rivers consulted Dr. Michael Chen, an expert in early photography, he leaned in with unease. The shadows on the grandfather were wrong, his skin waxy, his stillness unnatural even for the long exposures of the time. "Look at how the fabric sits on his shoulders," Dr. Chen whispered. "That is not how clothes fall on the living." And so what began as an innocent family portrait quickly deepened into a haunting puzzle, one that hinted at grief, secrecy, and a decision that defied the natural order. The photographer's ledger revealed more than careful scheduling. For the Whitmores, he had charged double his usual fee, clearing the entire day for their portrait. In his private notes, tucked away in a separate book, one brief line stood out: unusual circumstances. Family requested complete discretion. Will not display sample in studio window. A chilling phrase. The Whitmores had not only posed for their portrait, they had paid dearly to ensure it remained hidden. Professor Rivers began to see why. City records painted a picture of status and wealth. Samuel Whitmore, the silver-bearded patriarch, was no ordinary man. He was the founder of Whitmore Textile Manufacturing, a cornerstone of Philadelphia industry. His son George and daughter Margaret had married into respected families, their townhouse in Rittenhouse Square a symbol of elegance. But when Professor Rivers dug deeper into death records, she froze. Samuel Whitmore, according to official documents, had died of heart failure on October 12, 1903, 3 days before the portrait session. His death was signed by a trusted physician, Dr. Edmund Foster. The contradiction was undeniable. How could Samuel appear so composed, so present in a photograph dated October 15th? Further searches revealed an equally strange detail. His funeral had been private, attended only by close kin, with no notice in the press until nearly a month later. Only on November 8th did the Philadelphia Inquirer finally print an obituary, long delayed unusually so for a man of such prominence. It spoke of Samuel's devotion to family, his instructions for unity and remembrance, as though even in death he sought to bind his household together. When Professor Rivers shared these findings with Dr. Chen, his expression darkened. Then, "This isn't just a family portrait," he murmured. "It's post-mortem photography, made to look like life." Post-mortem photographs were not uncommon in the 19th and early 20th century. Families often captured one final likeness of the departed. But those images usually revealed the truth of death-closed eyes, stillness, a solemn pose. This was different. Here Samuel had been posed, dressed and lit, with painstaking care to appear among the living. The question was, why? The answer emerged in the pages of Samuel Whitmore's will, filed weeks later in probate court. Beneath layers of legal formality, a story of desperation unfolded. His textile empire was crumbling, battered by cheaper southern mills. Samuel had borrowed heavily, mortgaging not only his company, but his very life insurance policy. That policy, worth a fortune, required proof that Samuel was alive and well on October 15th. Even more pressing, his largest creditor had demanded a personal meeting with him on October 20th. If he failed to attend, the creditor could seize the company outright, plunging the entire family into ruin. The portrait then was not a memorial. It was evidence. Manufactured proof that Samuel still lived, carefully staged to buy the Whitmores' precious time. Financial ledgers from Morrison's studio confirmed it. The family had paid not just for the photograph, but for silence. Silence that cost dearly, and secrecy that would last for generations. The deception had worked. Records from the insurance company confirmed that by January of 1904, Samuel Whitmore's policy had been paid in full. The creditors, satisfied by the illusion of his continued life, settled with the family and allowed them to retain a measure of their wealth. Outwardly, the Whitmores had succeeded, but the price, as Professor Rivers would later uncover, was not measured in money at all. City archives showed the quiet unraveling of a family burdened by guilt. Within a year, George Whitmore sold the textile business and moved west to California, leaving behind the shadows of Philadelphia. His sister Margaret fared far worse. Records described her nervous collapse, treated in a private sanitarium, far from the public eye. And the children, the ones whose frightened eyes had once looked into the camera alongside their lifeless grandfather, carried the weight of that memory into adulthood. The photographer James Morrison left behind his own tortured testimony. Hidden in his journals were the words of a man torn between conscience and survival. On October 13th, 1903, just 2 days before the portrait he had written, the Whitmores have asked that their departed patriarch be posed as if alive. Though post-mortem photography is not new to me, this request troubles my soul. They wish him not as he is, but as he was, among them still. At first, Morrison refused. But desperation and a payment large enough to silence doubts persuaded him. In painstaking detail, his notes described the unsettling preparations. Samuel's body carefully arranged by an undertaker skilled in such illusions. A hidden framework of supports to seat him upright. Devices to hold open his glassy eyes. Hours spent applying powder and rouge to restore the color of life. The session lasted nearly 4 hours. Morrison recorded how the children whimpered, how their mother fainted more than once, and how several members became physically ill in the studio. Still, the image was captured. Samuel, the silent anchor of a family portrait that pretended he had not yet gone. Morrison's guilt clung to him for the rest of his life. He never again accepted work involving the dead, and his journals suggest the Whitmore Commission haunted him until his own death in 1925. Professor Rivers, tracing the thread of this secret across generations, eventually found Thomas Whitmore, a great-grandson of Samuel. At first, Thomas was reluctant to speak. But when he did, his words revealed how the silence of 1903 had seeped through time. The family never spoke of grandfather Samuel, he admitted softly. But there were always whispers. My grandmother Margaret would not allow photographs in her home. If anyone so much as mentioned his name, she would grow pale and agitated. Only later did I understand why. Thomas Whitmore, the great-grandson, finally revealed more. From an old wooden box, he brought out letters, fragile yellowed, with time, written by members of the family in the years that followed 1903. Their words bled with fear and sorrow. One letter penned in 1905 by young Robert Whitmore, just 12 years old at the time of the photograph, was almost unbearable to read. I still have nightmares about that day. He confessed to a cousin. Mother tells me I must never speak of grandfather's photograph, but it returns in my dreams. I cannot look at his face without remembering how cold his hand felt when they placed me beside him. The weight of secrecy scarred Margaret as well. Her medical records, which Thomas had inherited, told of nervous exhaustion and melancholia. She could not endure being photographed. Even the mention of funerals would send her spiraling into panic. Financially, the family had survived the insurance payout, stabilized their lives, but emotionally, they were hollowed. George Samuel's son drowned in guilt. He turned to drink, his marriage crumbling, and he died young in 1919. The secret poisoned our family, Thomas whispered to Professor Rivers. Even those of us born decades later, we always felt something terrible had happened. Only now do we know what it was. Professor Rivers pressed, further curious whether the fraud had ever come under suspicion. At the archives of Mutual Life Insurance Company, she uncovered the answer. In March 1904, just months after the payout, an internal memo flagged irregularities. An anonymous letter sent in February claimed Samuel had died before his policy renewal. Yet, when investigators examined the case, they found the portrait. October 15, 1903. Samuel Whitmore seated alive, or so it seemed. It was enough to close the matter. Even more striking, the files revealed that James Morrison himself had been questioned. The photographer had stood by the illusion he created, insisting Samuel was present and alert that day. In doing so, Morrison risked both his livelihood and the threat of criminal charges, but he chose silence and loyalty. The anonymous whistleblower remained a shadow. Someone close to the family had known the truth, perhaps even a member of the household unable to bear the guilt. but unwilling to reveal themselves. Their identity was never uncovered. The investigation, though inconclusive, left a lasting mark. Mutual life insurance quietly changed its policies after the Whitmore case, requiring medical exams, near policy renewals, and instituting stricter proofs of life. The deception of one grieving family had reshaped how an entire industry operated. For Professor Rivers, the final burden was her own. What should she do with this story? The fraud was more than a century old, beyond law and punishment, but its human weight lingered. After consulting museum ethicists, the consensus was clear. The tale was of historical importance, provided it was told with care. When she asked Thomas Whitmore, his answer was simple. Our family has carried this burden long enough. Let the truth be known. Perhaps it will show others the true cost of deception, even when born of desperation. And so, with the blessing of the descendants, the portrait became more than an eerie curiosity. It became a study of illusion and grief. Dr. Chen's analysis of the photograph entered the records of photographic history, a reminder that deception by lens is not unique to our digital age. Long before Photoshop, the camera could lie in the hands of a skilled artisan. The Whitmore case also stood as a quiet lesson in fragility. In an age without safety nets, one untimely death could unravel an empire. Families made choices, desperate choices, that blurred the boundary between love survival and deception. The Whitmore's desperate actions were a stark reflection of the harshness of the industrial age. When Rivers turned to modern fraud investigators, they immediately recognized the case as particularly interesting from a historical perspective. The Whitmore scheme required careful planning and months of coordination with multiple people, a level of sophistication rarely seen in the early 20th century. David Martinez, a retired insurance investigator, commented, "The most haunting thing is not the trick, but the psychological cost to the family. They may have survived the immediate financial crisis, but the emotional scars will last for generations." The story becomes a classic example of the weight of secrets. Even when kept for good reasons, concealment can have long-term consequences. When Professor Rivers announced his findings at the annual meeting of the American Historical Association, the Whitmore case quickly attracted attention. Scholars recognized that it reflected a larger truth. Many seemingly prosperous middle-class families were actually just one small incident away from poverty. It was this vulnerability that paved the way for the birth of social insurance programs. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, an economic historian, said the Whitmore family was not alone. Many families in that period lived in a similar situation, lacking any safety net. If the breadwinner fell, the whole family lost its economic foundation. The story also revealed another aspect, the limits and potential of early photography. Historians of photography were amazed by Morrison's technique. His understanding of light composition and the way he concealed death challenged what people thought was possible for photographers of the time. Child psychologists saw in this case a haunting example of transgenerational trauma. For the children in the photo had not only lost their grandfather but were forced to pretend he was still alive. They grew up with a secret that was completely at odds with their own perceptions, explains Dr. Sarah Kowalski. And this contradiction left a deep imprint on their psyches. More than just a historical case, the Whitmore study became training material for insurance investigators, demonstrating that human motivations and psychological pressures, even a century ago, still illuminate fraud today. Museums across the country began requesting copies of the photograph and investigative materials to display in exhibitions about family history, economic fragility, and the blurring between photography and reality. 2 years after the initial discovery, Professor Rivers unexpectedly received a letter. It was written by Rebecca Whitmore Chen, Samuel Whitmore's great-granddaughter. Rebecca said that when she read the article about the photo, she was able to piece together many family memories. My great-grandmother was always afraid when someone wanted to take a group photo. She would often have panic attacks but never explained. We used to think she was eccentric. Now I understand. She was one of the children in the 1903 photo. Rebecca later donated many family photos and documents to the museum. Among them was a 1925 letter from Margaret Whitmore, Samuel's daughter. It was the final piece of the puzzle. In the letter, Margaret confessed, "That photo still haunts me. Dad looked so peaceful in his last sleep, but we forced him to stand up to live again in a false moment. I fear that guilt will never leave the family." Margaret also revealed that she was the one who sent the anonymous letter to the insurance company in 1904, a desperate attempt to make amends. But she didn't have the courage to go public. Eventually, the Whitmore case became a permanent exhibition at the Philadelphia History Museum, titled "Hidden Truth When Photography Lies." Visitors can admire the original 1903 photograph, read Morrison's diary, family letters, and even participate in interactive activities to learn how to recognize traces of post-production and post-mortem photography. The exhibition quickly became one of the museum's most popular attractions. But more than anything, the Whitmore family's story serves as a reminder that the truth, no matter how painful, is always more healing than lies born of love and despair. Because their financial crisis lasted only a few months, the psychological ghosts linger for generations. At the opening of the exhibition Descendant, Thomas Whitmore stood before the crowd and whispered, "This photograph represents both the love of our ancestors and their fear of the truth." Today, in telling their story, we hope to honor their memory and to remind them that even in the most difficult times, the truth is the most precious gift a family can give to each other. And from that moment, Samuel Whitmore's posthumous portrait, hidden for more than a century, became an icon, a gentle reminder that no secret can sleep forever.